The gallery was buzzing, a steady hum of voices and clinking glasses filling the air. New York's elite mingled, draped in black and gold, admiring the sleek modern art installations scattered across the white-walled space. I stood in the center of it all, pretending to absorb the praise for our latest collection, but my eyes were elsewhere. Across the room, Tess was deep in conversation with Oliver. His sharp jawline, tousled brown hair, and youthful confidence grated on me. He was one of those types, an up-and-coming architect with enough charm to make people overlook his pretentiousness. I watched as Tess laughed at something he said, her hand lightly brushing his arm. A laugh that was too familiar, too intimate. My gut twisted. It wasn't the first time I'd felt something was off. Over the past few months, I had noticed the small changes: Tess coming home late from her design meetings, her sudden obsession with certain architects' work, and her phone always tucked away when I walked into the room. But I had pushed it aside. After all, we were a power couple in the art and design world. She was my wife, my partner, my muse. This, whatever this was, couldn't be what I thought. But tonight, the way her eyes lit up when Oliver spoke, the way she leaned in just a bit too close, it felt like a slap in the face. And the worst part? Everyone in the room could see it. They were all watching, pretending not to notice, but I knew they were. I could feel the judgment, the whispers just beneath the surface. In this world, appearances were everything, and tonight, mine was cracking. I forced a smile, nodding absent-mindedly to an art critic who was singing the praises of my latest sculpture. The words were a blur. I couldn't stop staring at Tess, the perfect wife, the perfect liar. Then came the text. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I slipped it out, glancing down at the screen. It was a picture. Tess and Oliver leave a hotel. Their bodies close, her hand on his chest, his arm around her waist. I froze. The critic's voice droned on, oblivious to the storm building inside me. My fingers tightened around the phone. The air in the gallery suddenly felt too thick, too suffocating. I looked back at Tess, her laughter floating across the room, and everything inside me snapped. This wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal in every sense of the word. She wasn't just cheating on me, she was flaunting it, right under my nose, in front of our colleagues, our friends, and our world. And Oliver? That smug little bastard thought he could walk into my life and take what was mine. Not tonight. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the photo burned into my mind. The critic finished speaking, expecting some response, but I barely registered him. I excused myself and began to weave through the crowd, making my way to Tess and Oliver. My heart was pounding, each step heavier than the last, my mind racing with the weight of what I was about to do. But the rage kept me moving forward. I didn't know how this was going to end. All I knew was that it had to start here. Tess didn't see me coming. Her back was to me, still leaning in toward Oliver as if the whole room didn't exist. As I closed the distance, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes just before a storm hits. My hand gripped my drink tightly, fingers tightening around the glass as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored in place. I reached them, standing just a foot away. Oliver noticed me first, his eyes flicking up from Tess to meet mine. For a split second, something crossed his face: surprise. Maybe guilt, but he quickly masked it with that same smooth, practiced grin. Tess, too wrapped up in whatever they were whispering about, hadn't even turned around yet. "Michael," Oliver said, lifting his glass in a mock toast, "great show tonight." Tess finally turned, her smile faltering when she saw me. "Michael, I didn't know you." "I'm sure you didn't," I cut her off, my voice low and steady. The calm felt unnatural, like a dam about to burst. I turned to Oliver. "Enjoying yourself?" "Of course," he said, not missing a beat. The arrogance was written all over his face. "Your work is always impressive." "I was just telling Tess how much I admire." "Save it." My voice hardened, cutting through the fake compliments. I was done with the pleasantries. "I don't need you to admire anything." Tess's eyes darted between us, sensing the tension. "Michael, what's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with warning. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how bad it was. "Not yet." I stared at her, at the woman I had shared my life with for years, the woman I thought I knew. Now, she was a stranger, someone capable of smiling in my face while sneaking around behind my back. I could feel the weight of the photo in my pocket, burning a hole through the fabric. The truth was right there, undeniable, and it took everything in me not to throw it in her face. Instead, I leaned in closer, speaking so only the two of them could hear. I know. Tess blinked, confusion flashing across her face. Know what? I didn't answer her. Instead, I pulled out my phone, unlocking it with a quick swipe. The photo was right there, Tess and Oliver wrapped in each other's arms outside the hotel, caught in the act. I held the phone up between us, the image glowing on the screen, the proof of her betrayal laid bare. Her face drained of color. Michael? Oliver's grin faded, his confidence wavering for the first time. He shifted uncomfortably beside her, eyes narrowing as he tried to assess just how bad this was going to get. I didn't let Tess speak. How long? My voice was cold and detached, like I was asking her about the weather instead of our life falling apart. How long have you been screwing him? Michael, please, she whispered, glancing around the gallery. People were watching now, their eyes darting between the art and us, pretending not to eavesdrop but hanging on every word. I didn't care. Let them see. Let them all see what she had done. I asked you a question. My voice dropped lower, the anger bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. How long? Tess's eyes filled with tears, her lip trembling as she struggled to speak. It was a mistake, she said finally, her voice barely audible. It didn't mean anything. Please, Michael, A mistake? I laughed, the sound bitter and harsh. It didn't mean anything? You've been sneaking around with him, humiliating me, and you want to say it didn't mean anything? I turned to Oliver, who was standing there like a deer caught in headlights. And you think you can walk into my life, take my wife, and there'll be no consequences? He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. You think this is over? It's not. I'm going to ruin you. Oliver's face paled, the confidence draining from him completely now. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew what I could do. Tess reached for me, her hand trembling as she grabbed my arm. Michael, please, don't do this. We can fix this. Please, just fix this? I pulled my arm away, her touch burning like fire. We're past fixing, Tess. I turned on my heel, leaving them standing there in the middle of the gallery, exposed for everyone to see. I could feel their eyes on my back, the whispers growing louder as I made my way toward the exit. But I didn't care. I had said enough. Now, it was time to act. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war. The ride home was a blur of streetlights and angry silence. Tess hadn't followed me out of the gallery. I wasn't sure if that was a relief or another sting of betrayal. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as I sped through the city. I couldn't even feel the road beneath the tires. All I could feel was the burning in my chest, the steady drum of rage that had only just begun. I pulled into the driveway of our brownstone, cutting the engine but not moving. The quiet of the night felt too loud, my thoughts racing as I replayed everything over and over again in my head. Tess and Oliver, the hotel, the lies. The gallery was filled with people pretending they didn't know when I was sure they did. They had all watched the show unfold tonight, every one of them with their smug little smiles, pretending to admire the art while they gossiped behind our backs. I wasn't going to let it slide. I climbed out of the car, slammed the door behind me, and stormed up the steps to the front door. The key barely fit in the lock, my hands shaking with adrenaline, but I forced it open and stepped inside. The house was dark and quiet. Too quiet. I could feel her absence like a void, the walls closing in on me as I walked through the front hall, past the framed artwork we had collected over the years. Every piece felt like a mockery now, a symbol of the life we had built together, only to watch it fall apart in a matter of minutes. I stopped in the living room, staring at the shelves lined with books on art, design, and architecture. Oliver's specialty. My jaw tightened. He had always been too close. Tess had insisted it was all professional, that they were just collaborating, working on projects that were important for her career. I'd been naive. No, stupid. I had ignored the signs, the late nights, the excuses. I had let him into our lives, and now he was ripping it apart. But I wasn't just going to sit here and take it. No. If Oliver thought he could waltz in and destroy everything I'd built, he had another thing coming. I crossed the room to my desk, the familiar hum of my computer flickering to life as I sat down. The glow from the screen washed over me, and for the first time that night, I felt a sense of control. My fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up Oliver's portfolio, his projects, and his professional connections. He was talented, sure, but there was always someone more talented. Someone hungrier. And in this world, your reputation was everything. I opened another browser tab and started typing, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't have to destroy him physically. No, that would be too easy. I needed to tear down everything he stood for. His work, his credibility, his reputation. People like Oliver, people who relied on their public image, their carefully curated facade, couldn't survive a hit like this. He was still new to the scene, still establishing himself. One bad rumor, one crack in the foundation, and everything he had worked for would come crashing down. I scrolled through articles and interviews, looking for anything I could use. And then I found it, a project from a few years back. It was one of his early works, a design for a luxury hotel in Chicago. I remembered hearing about it through some colleagues at the time, but now that I was looking at it closely, something about the design seemed familiar. Too familiar. I opened another window, pulling up an obscure but iconic design from a European architect I'd come across years ago while traveling. The resemblance was uncanny. The angles, the layout, even the materials, Oliver had lifted it, almost piece by piece. And it wasn't just inspiration. It was blatant theft. My heart raced as I realized what I was looking at. This was it. This was how I'd ruin him. I quickly began drafting an email, using an anonymous account. I attached the comparison photos, outlining the similarities in detail. The recipient was a well-known design magazine editor I'd met at several events over the years. He loved a good scandal, especially one that could shake up the architectural world. I kept the message vague enough to protect myself but specific enough to make them curious. I knew it wouldn't take much for them to run with it. Oliver was hot right now, and the higher you climb, the harder you fall. By the time I hit send, my heart was pounding. I leaned back in the chair, the adrenaline from the evening still coursing through me. Tess and Oliver thought they'd gotten away with it, that they could have their fun and I'd just roll over. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. No, I was going to destroy them first. And when it was over, they'd regret ever underestimating me. As I sat there in the darkness, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a shroud, a strange calm settled over me. I knew it wouldn't be long before the first cracks started to show. And when they did, Oliver's entire world would collapse. Tess had chosen him, but soon, she'd see what it cost. And I'd be there, watching it all burn. The following morning, the world seemed strangely quiet, as if holding its breath. I woke up earlier than usual, my body restless and on edge, the adrenaline from the night before still pulsing through me. Tess hadn't come home, and her absence was like a void in the house, echoing through every empty room. But I didn't care. Let her stay wherever she was. I had more important things to focus on. I made myself a coffee, the bitter taste grounding me as I sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, waiting. The magazine I had contacted was known for its speed. They lived for breaking stories, for exposing the cracks in the glamorous lives of people like Oliver. It was only a matter of time before they bit. And then, just as I was finishing my second cup, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the editor. A short, curt response, but it was all I needed, thanks for the tip. We'll look into it. I leaned back in my chair, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. They were on it. Now, it was just a waiting game. The hours ticked by slowly. But I wasn't idle. I spent most of the day at my studio, half-heartedly working on some new pieces while keeping an eye on my phone. The calm I'd felt last night was now replaced with a growing sense of anticipation, the knowledge that at any moment, the first domino could fall. It wasn't until late afternoon that it happened. The headline hit my phone like a jolt of electricity. Rising star architect accused of plagiarism, design theft or coincidence? It was plastered all over one of the biggest design magazines in the country. Accompanied by side-by-side images of Oliver's hotel project and the European architect's original design. The article was brutal. They didn't outright accuse him of theft, but they didn't need to. They'd laid out the evidence piece by piece, letting the readers draw their own conclusions. The comments section was already blowing up with people debating, speculating, and tearing into Oliver. I sat there, staring at the screen, the satisfaction washing over me like a wave. This was just the beginning. By evening, the story had spread to other publications, social media, and architecture blogs. People were talking, sharing the article, and dissecting every detail. Oliver's reputation, once gleaming with promise, was now tarnished with doubt. And I knew the art world well enough to understand how quickly a rumor could become truth. No one would hire an architect under suspicion of stealing ideas. His clients would pull out, his contracts would dry up, and soon, Oliver would be nothing but a cautionary tale. I poured myself a drink, feeling the tension in my body finally start to ease. The first stage of my plan had worked better than I'd hoped. Now, all I had to do was wait and watch as everything Oliver had worked for came crashing down. And Tess? Well, she'd see soon enough that she'd bet on the wrong man. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach Tess. 2 days after the scandal broke, she came home. I heard the door creak open in the middle of the night, her soft footsteps hesitant as she walked through the house. I stayed where I was, sitting in the darkened living room, the glow from the streetlights casting long shadows on the walls. I wasn't sure if I wanted to confront her or let her stew in the mess she'd created, but when she finally appeared in the doorway, the choice was made for me. She looked terrible. Her usually flawless appearance was gone, hair messy, makeup smudged, eyes red and swollen from crying. She stood there, staring at me like a stranger as if she wasn't sure how to approach me. "Michael," she said, her voice hoarse. I didn't know if I should come home. I didn't respond right away, taking a slow sip from the glass of whiskey in my hand. I let the silence stretch between us, thick and heavy. Finally, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Where've you been?" Tess swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she rubbed them together. "At a friend's." I needed time to think. I nodded slowly, my eyes never leaving hers. "Thinking about what, exactly? How long you were going to keep this up? Or how you were going to explain why your lover is now at the center of a public scandal?" She flinched at the word lover, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "I'm sorry, Michael. I never meant for any of this to happen." I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped me. "Oh, you didn't mean for this to happen? You didn't mean to cheat on me, or you didn't mean for your precious Oliver to get exposed as a fraud?" Her lip trembled, and she stepped further into the room, her voice shaking. "I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't." "Of course, you didn't," I cut her off. Standing up now, my body tense. "Because you don't think about anyone but yourself, Tess. You never do. This is what happens when you play with fire. You get burned." Tess broke down then, collapsing into the chair by the window, her sobs muffled as she buried her face in her hands. I watched her, the woman who had once been everything to me, now crumbling before my eyes. And part of me felt nothing. No sympathy. No regret. Just the cold satisfaction of knowing that this was the price she had to pay. "I've lost clients," she said between sobs. "People don't want to work with me anymore because of this. They think I knew. They think I was part of it." I crossed my arms over my chest, watching her. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you got involved with him." She looked up at me then, her face streaked with tears. "Do you really hate me that much?" I paused, considering her question. Hate? No, it wasn't hate. Not entirely. What I felt was something darker, something colder, betrayal that had twisted into something unrecognizable. "I don't hate you, Tess," I said quietly. "But I'm done with you." She stared at me, the reality of what I just said sinking in. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. The marriage we had built, the life we had shared, was already shattered beyond repair. And I had no intention of picking up the pieces. The headlines kept coming. Every day, a new piece of Oliver's career crumbled away, leaving him exposed to the world for what he really was. The plagiarism allegations had taken root in the architecture community. And now, clients were pulling out faster than he could manage. He had tried to put out statements and hired a PR firm to handle the damage, but it was no use. The whispers were too loud, the evidence too damning. I watched it all unfold from a distance, satisfied. This was what I'd been waiting for. Every article and every social media post tearing him apart was a step closer to his complete destruction. I didn't need to say a word. The world had done my dirty work for me. It didn't take long before he tried to contact me. The first few texts were polite, asking if we could meet and discuss what had happened. I ignored them. He followed up with emails, then phone calls, his tone becoming more desperate with each attempt. I wasn't interested in hearing his side of the story. There was nothing he could say that would change what he had done. A week after the story broke, I got a knock on my door. I opened it to find Oliver standing there, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His usually immaculate appearance was gone. His hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Michael, please," he said, his voice raw. "I just need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "There's nothing to talk about, Oliver." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing on the front step. "I know you're angry. I know I messed up. But this is going too far. My career is on the line." I didn't say anything, letting the silence hang between us. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to me?" He continued, his voice rising. "I've lost 3 clients in the last week. 3. They all think I'm some kind of fraud now. And Tess, she won't even talk to me." I raised an eyebrow at that. "Oh, Tess won't talk to you? That's rich." He stopped pacing, turning to face me, his expression pleading. "Look, I know what I did was wrong. But these accusations, they're going to destroy me. You have to help me." I let out a cold laugh. "Help you? You slept with my wife, Oliver. And now you want my help?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off, stepping closer. "You think I didn't see this coming? Do you think I didn't know what kind of man you were the moment you started hanging around Tess? You played with fire, and now you're getting burned." His face crumpled, the desperation in his eyes more apparent now. "Michael, please. I'll do anything. Just tell me how to fix this." I stared at him for a long moment, the weight of everything he had done crashing down on him. And in that moment, I realized something. I didn't care. "You can't fix this, Oliver," I said quietly. "It's already too late." With that, I closed the door in his face, leaving him standing there, broken and desperate. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the street was the only sign that he had finally given up. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. Oliver's fall was complete, and there was no coming back from it. Whatever happened to him now was his own doing. But as I turned away from the door, the realization hit me: this wasn't over. Not yet. There was still Tess. The days after my conversation with Oliver were eerily quiet. Tess hadn't come home since our last confrontation, and I knew she was staying with friends, probably trying to piece together what was left of her life. Part of me wanted to track her down and demand answers, but another part of me knew it didn't matter. We were past that. Our relationship, our marriage, it had been dead long before Oliver ever came into the picture. Still, I knew we couldn't avoid each other forever. The house felt empty without her, the silence stretching on, suffocating. I had built my revenge carefully and meticulously, and now that it was nearly complete, there was one final thing left to do. I called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "Michael, we need to talk," I said. "In person." There was a long pause. I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she finally replied. "Okay, when?" "Tonight, at the house. 7 p.m. She agreed, and I hung up, the final piece of the plan falling into place. I didn't know what I wanted from this meeting. Closure? Some kind of finality? Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to see her face when she realized what she had thrown away. That evening, I waited in the living room, the same place where I had confronted her the first time. The whiskey sat untouched on the table, but I wasn't drinking tonight. I wanted to be clear-headed about this. The door opened quietly at 7:10. Tess walked in, her eyes scanning the room cautiously like she didn't recognize the home we had shared for so many years. She looked fragile, worn down by the weight of everything that had happened. But I wasn't going to let that affect me. Not now. "Michael," she started, her voice soft. "I know I can't take back what I did. But, can we at least talk? Please?" I stood up, facing her. "Talk about what, Tess? What's left to say?" She took a few steps closer, her eyes pleading. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But that doesn't mean we can't try to fix this. We've been together for so long. We owe it to ourselves to at least try." I shook my head, the coldness creeping back into my chest. "Try? After everything you've done? After you tore this marriage apart and threw it away for him?" Tess's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel anything. Not anymore. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "You didn't want to hurt me? Tess, you didn't even think about me. You were too busy with your affair, with your new life, to even care about what this would do to us." She sobbed then, her hands covering her face as she sank into the chair by the window, the same chair where she had broken down that night. But this time, her tears didn't move me. This time, they only reminded me of everything we had lost. I walked over to her, my voice low but firm. "It's over, Tess. There's no fixing this. I don't hate you. I just I don't feel anything anymore. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling. What are we going to do? I stared at her, the finality of the moment settling over me. We're going to move on, Tess. Separately. Her face crumpled, the truth of my words hitting her like a punch. And in that moment, I knew there was nothing left between us. No love, no trust, no future. Just the wreckage of what we used to be. I turned away, heading for the door. I'll call the lawyers in the morning, I said quietly. We'll figure out the rest. And with that, I walked out, leaving her in the silence of the house that had once been our home. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever, like the walls were closing in, suffocating what was left of the memories we had once shared. I'd left Tess behind, broken and defeated, but as I stepped out into the night, I felt no sense of triumph, no real satisfaction. My revenge was complete, and yet the emptiness inside me remained. The next few days were a blur of meetings with lawyers, and sorting out the logistics of our separation. Tess and I agreed to divide our assets quietly, without dragging things through the courts. It was strange, sitting across from her in that sterile office, discussing our life like it was a business transaction. But that's all it was now, a division of property, money, and the scraps of our past. Tess barely spoke during the meetings. She just sat there, her eyes hollow, nodding in agreement to whatever the lawyers proposed. I wondered if she had any fight left in her, or if she'd already accepted that this was the inevitable end. I hadn't heard from Oliver since the day I shut the door in his face, and part of me wondered what he was doing now. His career was still in freefall. The allegations of plagiarism had snowballed into accusations of financial mismanagement and conflicts of interest. More articles surfaced, detailing the collapse of his most ambitious projects. The architectural community had turned its back on him. I didn't need to lift another finger. He was finished. Tess, on the other hand, was facing her own challenges. Her connections in the art and design world were starting to unravel. People who had once admired her work now looked at her with suspicion, wondering if she had been complicit in Oliver's downfall or if she had known about his misdeeds. I had no idea how deep her involvement with him went, but I suspected that it didn't matter anymore. Her name was tainted by association, and in our world, reputation was everything. One night, after another round of legal discussions, I sat in my studio, staring at a blank canvas. The paintbrush felt heavy in my hand, as though the act of creating art had become meaningless. For years, Tess had been my muse, my partner, the person who understood the language of my work in a way no one else did. But now, she was a stranger. And my art, once vibrant and alive, felt like an empty shell. I needed to break free of this. Of her. Of everything that had happened. That night, I made a decision. I was going to leave. Not just the house, but the city, the life we had built. There was nothing left for me here. I'd thought revenge would give me closure, but all it had done was leave me feeling hollow, as if I'd lost something far more important than Tess. 2 weeks later, I was gone. I left behind the city that had once been the center of my world and moved to a small town along the coast. It was the kind of place where no one knew my name, where I could disappear into the background and start again. The house I rented was modest, nothing like the sprawling loft Tess and I had shared. It was quiet, overlooking the ocean, with wide windows that let in the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. I spent my days walking along the beach, clearing my head, trying to find the part of myself that had been lost in the wreckage of my marriage. The ocean was calming, its endless horizon reminding me that life went on, even when everything else had fallen apart. I avoided the art world. I didn't check the news, didn't read the magazines. I didn't care what had become of Oliver or Tess. As far as I was concerned, they were part of a different life, one that I had left behind. But as the weeks passed, I found myself slowly returning to my work. It started with small sketches, doodles in the margins of notebooks, and lines that didn't mean anything at first. But then, slowly, those lines began to take shape, to form something new. It wasn't the kind of art I had done before. There was no glamour, no sophistication. It was raw, stripped down, like I was trying to carve out the pieces of myself that had been buried beneath the chaos of the last few months. One afternoon, as I was working on a piece, my phone rang. I hadn't spoken to many people since I left, so the sound startled me. I picked it up, seeing an unfamiliar number. Michael? A familiar voice came through the line, soft, tentative. It was Tess. I hadn't expected to hear from her again. We'd signed the final divorce papers 2 weeks earlier, and as far as I was concerned, that was the last chapter of our story. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. I needed to talk," she said. "Please, just hear me out." I didn't respond, letting the silence hang between us. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear what she had to say. After everything, what more could she possibly add? "I know I hurt you," she continued. "I know I destroyed everything we had. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I need you to know that I'm sorry." I closed my eyes, the sound of the ocean filling the space around me. Her apology felt like too little, too late. But there was something in her voice, a kind of desperation I hadn't heard before. "I don't need your apology, Tess," I said finally. "What's done is done." "I know," she whispered. "But I wanted you to know that I'm leaving the city. I can't stay there anymore. Not after everything that happened." I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me felt relief, knowing that she was moving on, just like I had. But another part of me, a deeper part, wondered if either of us would ever truly be free from the damage we had caused. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," I said, my voice softer now. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then, quietly, she said, "I hope you do, too." She hung up, leaving me alone once again, with nothing but the sound of the waves and the weight of our past pressing down on me. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the horizon. Maybe Tess was right. Maybe we were both searching for something. Some kind of redemption, some way to make sense of everything we had lost. But I wasn't sure if we'd ever find it. All I knew was that I was done looking back. The only way forward was through the storm, and I was ready to face it, alone. The days bled into each other as the ocean's rhythm became my only company. I had thought that leaving everything behind, Tess, Oliver, the city, would bring me peace. I had imagined that starting over in this quiet coastal town would cleanse me of the bitterness, the anger, and the suffocating weight of betrayal. But I was wrong. The loneliness hit harder than I expected. It was strange. Tess had been my enemy for so long, her betrayal a wound that refused to heal. Yet, now that she was truly gone from my life, I found myself haunted by memories of her, memories that crept into the quiet moments of my new existence. I couldn't stop thinking about her voice on the phone, the raw sincerity in her apology. I didn't want her forgiveness. I didn't want anything from her, or so I had convinced myself. But the truth was, even in the aftermath of all we had been through, a part of me missed her. Or maybe it wasn't Tess herself that I missed, but the life we had before it all fell apart. I spent my mornings walking along the shore, hoping that the ocean could somehow wash away the feelings I couldn't shake. The waves crashed against the rocks, relentless and indifferent, like time itself. I watched as they eroded the shoreline, slowly wearing away the earth beneath my feet, and I wondered if that was what had happened to Tess and me. Maybe it hadn't been Oliver or the affair that destroyed us. Maybe it was the years of small resentments, the unspoken frustrations, the distance that grew between us long before she ever found herself in his arms. I couldn't say for sure. But what I did know was that, for the first time since the divorce, I felt lost. The sketches I had been working on started to feel empty and meaningless. I tried to pour my thoughts into the art, to make sense of everything, but the more I tried, the more the lines blurred, the shapes collapsing in on themselves like a reflection in a shattered mirror. I wasn't creating anymore, I was just trying to survive. One afternoon, as I sat in my studio, staring blankly at a half-finished painting, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me out of my haze, the sound so unexpected that I almost didn't recognize it. I hadn't spoken to anyone since my brief conversation with Tess. I hadn't wanted to. I opened the door to find my neighbor, a woman in her mid-50s, standing there with a basket of fresh bread. Her name was Helen, and though we had only exchanged pleasantries in passing, she seemed genuinely kind. "I thought you might like some company," she said, offering me a small smile. "I know you've been keeping to yourself." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I wasn't used to kindness anymore, it felt foreign and uncomfortable. But something in her eyes made me step aside and gesture for her to come in. She placed the basket on my kitchen table, the smell of the warm bread filling the room. For a moment, the house didn't feel quite so empty. "Thank you," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "You didn't have to do this." She waved her hand dismissively. "I've been living in this town long enough to know when someone's going through a rough time. Figured you could use a little break." We sat together at the table, the bread between us. She didn't pry or ask about my past, but there was a warmth to her presence that I hadn't realized I needed. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the most meaningful thing in the world. As we ate, Helen told me stories about her late husband, and how they had moved to this town years ago after his diagnosis. She spoke of love, loss, and the quiet strength it took to rebuild a life after everything fell apart. Her words stuck with me, echoing long after she had left. Maybe there was still a way to rebuild, a way to move forward without being weighed down by the past. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Helen's visit had sparked something in me, a reminder that life didn't have to be defined by pain and loss. There was still beauty in the world, still moments of connection to be found, even in the quietest corners. I started sketching again, but this time, it wasn't out of desperation. There was something different in my approach, a freedom in the way I let the lines flow. I didn't have a specific image in mind, I just let my hand move across the page, trusting the process. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Tess, about Oliver, or even about the revenge that had consumed me. I wasn't trapped in the past anymore. I was creating for the sake of creation, letting the art lead me wherever it wanted to go. As the days passed, I found myself venturing out more. I went to the local market, met a few of the townspeople, and slowly started to feel like I was becoming part of something again. The isolation I had sought when I first arrived was beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. One afternoon, as I was sitting at a small cafe near the pier, sketchbook in hand, I overheard a conversation at the next table. Two women were discussing a local gallery that was looking for new artists to feature in an upcoming exhibit. My ears perked up at the mention of the gallery. It was the kind of place I would have never considered before. Too small, too local. But now, it seemed like exactly what I needed. I approached the woman after their conversation ended, asking for more details. They were more than happy to tell me about the gallery, excited that someone new might be interested in contributing. They gave me the owner's name and encouraged me to stop by. Later that week, I found myself standing outside the gallery. It was a modest space, tucked between a bookstore and a bakery, but there was something inviting about it. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The owner, a woman named Rachel, greeted me with a warm smile. I introduced myself and told her that I had heard she was looking for new artists. She looked me up and down, clearly intrigued. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to define what I had been creating lately. "It's abstract, mostly. But personal." She nodded thoughtfully. "Bring some pieces by next week. Let's see what you've got." I left the gallery feeling a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. This wasn't the high-profile world of art that I had once been a part of, but maybe that was a good thing. Maybe I needed to start small, to rediscover why I had fallen in love with creating in the first place. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was moving forward. The past was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer held the same power over me. And as I stood by the ocean that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that this was what healing looked like, not forgetting, but letting go. There was still so much ahead of me. The night of the gallery opening arrived faster than I had expected. Standing outside the small space, I took a deep breath, staring up at the sign that bore my name along with the other featured artists. The reality of it all hit me. It had been years since I'd shown my work to anyone. This was a different world, a quieter one, but still, it meant something. I hadn't invited anyone. There was no one to invite, really. I didn't need the fanfare. The crowds of critics or collectors that used to fill the openings back in the city. This was something smaller, more intimate, a fresh start in every sense. Yet as I stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel the same old nerves creeping in, the familiar tension that came with putting yourself on display. The gallery was modest, filled with a quiet hum of conversation as locals moved from piece to piece. My work was hung along one of the far walls, 3 large abstract paintings, born out of the solitude and chaos of the last few months. They were raw and unfiltered, stripped down from the perfectionism that had once defined my style. There was no Tess in these pieces. No trace of Oliver or the man I used to be. It was just me, what was left after the storm. Rachel, the gallery owner, caught my eye as I entered, offering a small wave. She had been kind and patient, giving me space to work through whatever it was I needed to. She didn't know the details of my past, didn't pry into the wreckage of my personal life, and I was grateful for that. This gallery, this new chapter, wasn't about the mistakes I had made. It was about what came after. As the evening went on, I found myself blending into the background, watching as people moved through the space, reacting to my work in their own quiet ways. A few approached me with compliments, asking about my process and my inspirations. I kept my answers vague. This art was personal, too personal to explain in a casual conversation. But their interest, their appreciation, was enough. At one point, Helen arrived, offering a small smile as she moved toward my paintings. I hadn't told her about the opening, but she must have heard through word of mouth. She studied the pieces in silence, her eyes lingering on the lines and colors that I had poured so much of myself into. After a while, she came over to where I was standing by the back wall. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "I can see the pain in them, but there's hope too." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Helen had been a quiet presence in my life, a reminder that not all connections needed to be dramatic or destructive. She had offered me small moments of kindness when I needed them most, and now, seeing her here, I felt a sense of gratitude that I couldn't quite put into words. "Thank you," I finally managed. "It's been a journey." She smiled gently. "I think it always is." As the night wore on, I began to feel a strange sense of peace settling over me. This gallery, this night, wasn't just about showcasing my art. It was about reclaiming a part of myself that I had thought was lost. The betrayal, the anger, the need for revenge, they were all still there, somewhere deep inside. But they didn't define me anymore. I had found a way to move forward, to take the broken pieces of my life and turn them into something new. Near the end of the night, just as the crowd was beginning to thin, I saw her. Tess. She was standing at the entrance, her eyes scanning the room, and when they landed on me, she hesitated. I hadn't expected her to come, hadn't wanted her to, but now that she was here, a strange calm washed over me. She approached slowly, her steps tentative, as if unsure of her place in this new version of my life. I watched her carefully, waiting for the familiar wave of anger, of resentment, but it didn't come. All I felt was a quiet resignation. "Michael," she said softly when she finally reached me. "I didn't know if I should come, but I wanted to see your work." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was no longer anything left to say between us. We were strangers now, linked only by a past that neither of us could change. She glanced over at the paintings, her gaze lingering on the raw, jagged strokes that I had used to express the turmoil inside me. For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. A silent understanding of what I had gone through. But she didn't say anything about it. Instead, she turned back to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said again. "For everything." I met her gaze, searching for the anger that had once driven me, but it was gone. Tess wasn't the woman I had loved, nor the woman I had hated. She was just Tess, a person who had made her choices, just as I had made mine. "I know," I said quietly. "It's in the past." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Though it didn't quite reach her eyes. We stood there for a moment longer, neither of us knowing what else to say. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I didn't feel relief or closure, but I didn't feel the weight of her betrayal anymore either. Tess was gone, and with her, the remnants of the life we had shared. All that remained was the present, this quiet gallery, the art that had come from my pain, and the future that stretched out before me. As I stood there, watching the last of the guests filter out, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and that, more than anything, was the only victory I needed. The morning after the gallery opened, I woke to the sound of seagulls outside my window. The light filtered through the curtains, soft and warm as if the world itself had shifted. There was a strange sense of calm in the air, a quiet that didn't feel like loneliness anymore. I lay in bed for a while, letting the events of the previous night replay in my mind. Tess showing up had been the last thing I expected, but even her presence hadn't shaken me. If anything, it had solidified what I already knew. That part of my life was truly over. The anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge, they no longer had power over me. I got up, showered, and made myself a cup of coffee, the ritual grounding me in the present. I still had work to do, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel like a burden. The gallery had been a success. Rachel had already mentioned the possibility of a future exhibit. It wasn't just the validation of my art that filled me with a sense of accomplishment. It was the fact that I had made it this far. After everything, I had found a way to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I spent the rest of the morning working on a new series of sketches. The inspiration flowed more easily now, the lines coming together without the usual frustration. It felt good to create again, not out of desperation or pain, but because I wanted to. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I wasn't surprised when I opened it to find Helen standing there. She held a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands, a smile on her face. "I wanted to stop by and congratulate you on the exhibit," she said, handing me the flowers. "You were incredible, Michael. Truly." "Thank you," I said, stepping aside to let her in. I wasn't sure how it would go, but it felt right. Better than I expected. We sat down at the table, and Helen looked at me with that quiet understanding she always had. She didn't pry, didn't ask about Tess or the past. She just let the moment be, offering me her quiet support. "I'm glad to hear that," she said after a moment. "You've been through a lot, but it seems like you're finally finding your way again." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle over me. I had been lost for so long, buried under the weight of everything that had happened. But now, with the gallery and the new sense of purpose I had found, it felt like I was on the verge of something new. "I think I am," I said quietly. We talked for a while longer, about art, the town, the little things that made up the fabric of everyday life. It was easy and effortless, and I found myself appreciating Helen's presence more than I ever had before. She had become an unexpected anchor in my life, a reminder that not all relationships had to be as complicated and destructive as the one I had with Tess. As she was getting ready to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to me. "I know it's still fresh," she said, her voice gentle. "But I think you've got a lot to look forward to, Michael. You've made it this far. Don't forget that." I nodded, her words resonating with me. For so long, I had been focused on the pain, on what I had lost. But now, for the first time, I was starting to see what I had gained. After Helen left, I returned to my sketches, letting the day pass in quiet contentment. There were no grand revelations, no dramatic changes, just a slow, steady sense of peace that had been absent from my life for far too long. That evening, I went for a walk along the beach, the sky turning shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The ocean was calm, its waves gently lapping at the shore, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the familiar pull of grief or anger. Instead, I felt something else, hope. As I stood there, watching the tide come in, I realized that I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what the future held, and I wasn't sure where this new chapter would take me. But that was okay. I didn't need to know. I had rebuilt once before, after Tess and the mess that followed. I could do it again, in this quiet town by the sea, with my art, my small circle of new friends, and the life I was slowly crafting for myself. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, I felt a strange sense of excitement for what lay ahead. For the first time in a long while, I was ready to move forward, not as the man I used to be, but as the man I was becoming. And that, I realized, was enough. The call came unexpectedly one afternoon, just as I was finishing a sketch. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer it. On the other end of the line was a voice I hadn't heard in months. "Michael, it's Oliver." I hadn't spoken to Oliver since everything had come crashing down. His voice sounded strained and tired, as if he had been carrying the weight of the last few months as heavily as I had. There was a pause, as though he was waiting for me to say something. But I stayed silent, letting him find his words. I wanted to, I don't know, explain. "Apologize, I guess," he finally said. His tone was uncertain, almost pleading, as though he knew no apology could ever be enough. My chest tightened at the sound of his voice. For a moment, I was back in that conference room, watching him stand beside Tess, their betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. I had spent so much time hating him, imagining how I'd make him pay for what he'd done. But now, standing in my quiet kitchen, that hatred felt distant, almost irrelevant. "I don't know if there's anything left to explain, Oliver," I said evenly. "We both know what happened." He exhaled, the sound heavy with regret. "Yeah, we do. But that's not why I'm calling. I've lost everything, Michael. My firm, my reputation. You really did a number on me." There was no bitterness in his voice, just resignation. He knew, just as I did, that his downfall hadn't been a coincidence. I had pulled the strings that led to his ruin and used every connection and resource I had to destroy him. And it had worked. Oliver's name was now synonymous with plagiarism, his career in architecture all but over. I didn't just lose my career, he continued after a long pause. I lost Tess, too. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt a strange pang of sympathy for him. I had wanted revenge and had craved it with a burning intensity that consumed me. But now, hearing the defeat in his voice, I wasn't sure if it had been worth it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I needed to tell someone. You were the one I hurt the most, and now, you're the only one left to hear it. Tess is gone. She left a few weeks ago, moved out of the city. I don't know where. I think she's trying to start over, too. The news of Tess leaving didn't surprise me. She had always been restless, always searching for something that wasn't there. But hearing that she was gone for good stirred something in me, a feeling I couldn't quite name. Oliver's voice broke through my thoughts. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Michael. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. The man on the other end of the line had once been the source of my deepest pain, the target of my rage. And now, he was just a broken man, standing in the wreckage of his own choices. "I'm sorry too," I finally said, surprising even myself. Oliver was silent for a moment, clearly not expecting my words. Then, with a quiet sigh, he responded, "Thank you." We didn't say much after that. There was nothing more to say. When I hung up the phone, I stood there for a long time, staring out the window at the waves crashing against the shore. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the revenge, the destruction that followed. And I realized something. Revenge had felt good at the moment, like a balm for the wound Tess and Oliver had left in me. But now, standing on the other side of it, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. Oliver was right. He had lost everything, and so had I. Tess was gone, and the life I had once imagined with her was long dead. But somewhere along the way, in the ashes of it all, I had found something else, something I hadn't even known I was looking for. I had found myself. The man I was now wasn't the same man who had walked into that gallery with vengeance burning in his chest. I wasn't the man who had spent sleepless nights plotting how to bring Oliver down. I wasn't even the man who had loved Tess with all his heart, blind to the cracks in our marriage. I was something different now. Stronger, maybe. Wiser. Certainly more scarred. As I stood there, watching the ocean rise and fall, I let the last of my anger drift away with the tide. There was no place for it anymore. Tess and Oliver were part of my past, but they didn't have to define my future. That night, I went back to my easel, picking up the brush with a steady hand. The blank canvas stared back at me, waiting, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of expectation or the need to prove anything. I didn't feel the pull of old wounds or the desire to settle scores. All I felt was the quiet joy of creation. As I began to paint, letting the colors flow from my brush, I realized that this was my true revenge. Not the destruction of others, but the reclamation of my own life. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. I had rebuilt myself, piece by piece, and I was finally free. The canvas before me was filled with bold, vibrant strokes, full of life, full of hope. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew that I had moved on. Not just from Tess or from Oliver, but from the man I used to be. I was ready to live again. The air was crisp the next morning, the kind of autumn chill that signaled change. I walked along the shoreline, the sound of the waves in sync with the rhythm of my steps. The beach was quiet, the sky a dull gray that stretched endlessly into the horizon. It felt peaceful in a way that soothed something deep inside me. It had been a few weeks since Oliver's call. After we spoke, I hadn't heard from him again, and I didn't expect to. That chapter of my life had closed. Tess was gone, Oliver was in ruins, and the anger that had once fueled my every move had faded into the background. What remained was a sense of clarity, an understanding that I had survived, that I had come out of the storm on the other side, not unscathed but whole. As I made my way down the beach, I thought about the gallery and what lay ahead. Rachel had been in touch again, eager to discuss future plans. A couple of pieces had sold after the opening, and the idea of continuing to create, to build something new from the wreckage of my old life, was no longer daunting. It was exciting, but art wasn't the only thing on my mind. Helen had become a steady presence in my life, a quiet comfort that I hadn't expected. We weren't anything official, not yet, but the space between us had shifted. There was a warmth in her eyes when we talked, a gentle ease in the way we spent time together. It wasn't the overwhelming passion I had once known with Tess, but it didn't need to be. This was different, steadier, and for the first time, I found myself looking forward to what might come next with someone new. As I rounded a bend in the shoreline, I spotted Helen in the distance, sitting on one of the large rocks that overlooked the water. She waved when she saw me, her smile lighting up her face. I quickened my pace, feeling the familiar pull of her presence. "Thought I'd find you here," she said as I approached. "Just needed some air," I replied, sitting down beside her. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the waves crash against the shore. There was something about the quiet moments with Helen that made everything else seem simpler, as if the chaos of the last year couldn't touch us here. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, her voice soft. "About moving, maybe getting a place closer to the gallery. I want to be part of that world again, in a way I wasn't before." I glanced at her, surprised but not entirely shocked. Helen had always been a woman of quiet ambition, someone who didn't need to announce her plans but worked toward them steadily. "Sounds like a good idea," I said. "I think the gallery could use someone like you." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Maybe, and who knows, maybe we could see where things go." It wasn't a declaration, not in the traditional sense. But it didn't need to be. We both understood what she meant. There was potential here, between us, and we were both willing to see where it led. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. "Yeah, I'd like that." We talked for a while longer, about the gallery, about art, about the future. There was no rush, no urgency to define what we were or where we were headed. It felt natural and easy, like we had all the time in the world to figure it out. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the water, we made our way back up the beach. Helen slipped her hand into mine as we walked, and I didn't pull away. There was a simplicity in that gesture, a quiet understanding that whatever came next, we would face it together. I had spent so much of my life chasing perfection, trying to control every aspect of my future, that I had forgotten how to let things unfold naturally. But now, with Helen by my side and the mess of my past finally behind me, I realized that I didn't need to force anything anymore. Life would move forward, with or without my interference, and for the first time, I was okay with that. As we reached the end of the beach, I turned to her, the words coming out before I had fully thought them through. "Do you want to come over for dinner?" She looked at me, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I'd love to." We made our way back to my place, the cool evening air wrapping around us as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. Inside, the warmth of the house greeted us, and I felt a sense of contentment settle in my chest. It was the first time in a long time that I felt truly at home, not just in my surroundings, but in my life. We spent the evening cooking together, a simple meal of pasta and wine, the conversation flowing easily between us. There was no heaviness, no lingering ghosts from the past. Just two people sharing a quiet night, enjoying each other's company. After dinner, we sat on the couch, the sound of the waves faint in the distance. Helen leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of everything, the past, the mistakes, the losses, slip away. I wasn't the man I had been when I first came to this town, broken and desperate for revenge. I wasn't the man who had been consumed by betrayal, or the man who had needed to prove something to the world. I was just me. And that was enough. As the night wore on, I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along. Not revenge, not validation, not even redemption, just peace. A quiet, steady life filled with small moments of joy, and the possibility of something new. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of the future. I was ready for it.